Michael Rotondi, Roto, Rotondi, Michael. A lot of names are associated with the face you're seeing. A lot of roles have been occupied by the face you're seeing. Michael Rotondi is the principal of Roto Architects. He is also one of the co-founders of Morphosis and worked with Morphosis for 15 years. He was also one of the Valiant group that founded SciArc in his senior year and has been part of SciArc all these years. Let me list what he's been doing at SciArc. So he graduated from SciArc in 1973. So it's been 42 years since you've graduated from SciArc. You started the graduate program in 1978. And
I was in the top 10. There were 10 of us. 10 students graduated.
And for 10 years, he served as the second director of SciArc from 1987 to 1997. He currently teaches as a distinguished faculty and is an honorary trustee. I'm going to quote Roto in a lecture he gave at SciArc in 1977. He said, "I brought in notes for psychological reasons, not for me, but for you. Because people always say they don't understand what I'm saying. So I thought having the notes up here will make people think I prepared a speech. So if I said something they didn't understand, it would be their fault, not mine. So Roto, I prepared today. So if there's anything I say wrong, it's not my fault. I'm safe." Rotondi, being part of SciArc, it's an inherent right as a student to be part of Roto's family, and Roto is part of yours. Thank you, Roto, for sitting down with me today.
You're welcome.
What do you believe was your first architectural project?
The first project informally was the things that I would build as a child with my brothers. I was always given the task of the heavy lifting by older brothers. I was the youngest. And what was included in that to my benefit was the one that had to figure out how to turn an angle iron trailer that we would find laying in the streets, pull it to our backyards, go to construction sites and get lumber, and then make a clubhouse out of it. We had a gigantic avocado tree, like a 100-year avocado tree, that covered an immense patio, which was perfect for an Italian immigrant family because the kitchen would roll out to the yard underneath this big tree. And in the tree, we would periodically attempt to build a treehouse. The way we learned was trial and error, which was also a really good process. I didn't understand that, when you're a kid, you don't understand structures, So you make something that the load has to go 90 degrees and bend, but you don't put enough stuff at the corner to transfer the load, so things would collapse. So we, fall out of trees, or the clubhouse collapses on top of 8 young kids, and they chase me around the neighborhood because we didn't have errors and omission insurance in those days. Errors and omission insurance was slugging you in the back. They would never want to leave any marks, so we always got hit in the back, or never, not in the stomach, but anyway. So formally, the first projects were while I was in school. Friends of my father. My father was a chef. Friends of his that were in the restaurant business thought they could get somebody cheap, and I never even thought about it, whether it was cheap or expensive, because I would do it for free, or some pasta, and design something in a restaurant, or extend the kitchen, or put in a skylight. I hung out with my mother and my father growing up, because I was the youngest and all the other kids were, if I wasn't hanging out with them, I'd stay at home and with my mother and watch her sew. She was a seamstress. And my father, being a chef, I would go to the restaurant with him and watch him cook. So I could see both parents go from nothing to something using their hands. And so using my hands was a rather natural thing. So all the first things we made were always labor intensive.
You talk about being autodidactic. What have you tried to teach yourself over your time as an architect?
There were two things. There were two reasons why I became interested in continuing what I call a structured curriculum from school until now. When I was, in order to hang out with my older brothers, even my sister, when you're the youngest, you're often thought of as extra weight. And I didn't want to be extra weight. It was painful. So I would learn everything that whoever I was going to hang out already knew. So I knew most of what my brothers already knew, and then some. The same with my sister. And then they thought I was a very clever little boy, you know. Listen what comes out of his mouth, you know. But it reached a level of autonomy. While in school, what I discovered is there really wasn't any teacher that was highly motivating to me, and it didn't inspire me. It was the education was rather rudimentary, and the people that were teaching were either second or third generation modernists. And when you take ideas without transforming those ideas, they become like a check that you try to cash a second time. They bounce. And my curiosity that began when I was a kid continued. I always had immense curiosity. It had to do with wanting to know more in order to impress my brothers, but it also had to do with being the youngest gives you a bit of a complex, like you're not the smartest person in the room. And that has stayed with me my whole life, which is I've realized that that's been actually a benefit, because it keeps me off of my high horse, as they say. I just had a curiosity. I decided that I wanted to know everything about everything before I died. The autodidact part of it was, in order to learn, you have to be on your own. You have to be on a mission. You don't necessarily have a vision yet because you don't see that far ahead of yourself when you're a kid. You know, it's like 10 minutes, and then as you get older, it could be 10 days, and then it becomes 10 weeks, and then 10 years. You know, and then that reverses itself at midlife, and you're looking equally backwards and forwards. You know, but wanting to know everything about everything really took hold when I was at Cal Poly, and I think it was the year that everything changed at Cal Poly. I saw Buckminster Fuller give a lecture, and it was like going to a Bruce Springsteen concert. You know, it was like 4.5 hours, his lectures. And the thing that was it was beyond impressive. It was like you were just awestruck. You would be there for an hour and a half, you'd leave, go to class, come back, he'd still be talking. You'd go get a sandwich, you come back, he'd still be talking. And he changed subjects. He could change the areas of knowledge that he was versed in were basically everything. The guy was not focused and tunneled in his vision. He could talk about physics, he could talk about biology, he could talk about engineering, he could talk about ecology, he could talk about light, matter, sound. It didn't matter. He could talk about everything. Not only to those of us that didn't know very much and were impressed, but he could talk at a level at and beyond physicists, at and beyond any of the people in the arts, the sciences, and the humanities. So I was really curious how anyone could do that, because I didn't have a good enough memory to be able to do that. Well, in reading everything I could get my hands on, my curiosity would say, how did that happen? When I was a kid, I've always wondered, how do all of those individual ingredients become a meal? How does my mother look at somebody wearing a dress and then go home and get a newspaper and start drawing on that newspaper the pattern, and then cut it and start to sew it as a mock-up, and start to see that it doesn't rotate, the shoulder doesn't rotate properly. So she then cuts the pattern in 2D, and then you look at the pattern and it doesn't look anything like it does when it becomes dimensional. And I was just always amazed at how my mother could do that. Eventually I began to, so all of the questions that you ask when you're a child, instead of not having them answered, I searched for the answers myself. Because I was the youngest, I had to become very independent, and so I was used to doing things on my own.
Talking about your mother's move from 2D to 3D and back and forth, your earlier projects were experimenting to see if you could design without a primary section or elevation. Could you maybe talk about the effect that has on the work?
I don't know if in the first, when you're a child and you're building things, you're not doing drawings. You're sketching, but you're building, you're working in full-size, real-time, straight to material. And there's no eraser, basically. As time goes on, what was the question?
Your earlier work was experimenting to see if you could be designing without a primary section or elevation.
No, I don't know about that. Where did you read that someplace?
You talked about it.
Because I love plan and I love section. Section is actually my favorite. Axonometric is really close because it's a very precise, measured drawing, but a section, I can design in section. I love designing in section. Because the section is where two-dimension becomes implicitly three-dimension. And so instead of looking at it as a 2D, it's basically an environment. The same way when I'm looking at a computer monitor, I don't see it as a flat plane. I see it as having depth. And the size of something in that plane has to do with the scale differential and not just dimension. So you can start to see it as having volume. And I'm not sure why I always had that capacity, but I did. It might be because I lived for 3 months in an incubator when I was born. I was born, I was 3 pounds, 8 ounces, a tiny little guy. My mother said that my head was here and my legs were just dangling. And then she would make fun of me in front of my friends, when I was in middle school. And she'd come in and say, oh, his head is the same size now. And then she showed me pictures, and it was pretty accurate. And then she'd put her fingers on her like that. But I think coming into the world in a way that you could actually, you don't know what you're experiencing, but you're bringing it in. I was in a bubble. And that was basically, it was comprehensible. There was me, there was the bubble, and then there was the world beyond. So the limits of space have always been evident to me. My spatial awareness is really good. I can be in a city once, and then be back in that city 20 years later, and recognize a spot that I was standing in by the nature of the relationships and the spatial dimension. And then know you got to go up there and turn left to go to someplace. Just always was able to do that. But the plan, we would work, I'm trying to think, because we loved drawing. We've always, working with Tom, whomever I've worked with, but especially Tom. Tom, is in some ways, it was very similar to hanging out with my next brother, who was 18 months older than me, who we had a relationship where he would bring things out of me that I didn't even know I had inside of me. So he created a context that allowed me to see what capacities I had. And working with Tom was like that. His energy, his intensity, his growing up like I did, his interest in using his hands and figuring things out by making things and not theorizing. What we both, I think, had in common is that we learned how to use our hands before we knew why we were using them. You know, so experience came first, and then idea came second. We had ideas, but it wasn't the ideas that came from another source. They would come from another source by us seeing things, but then in seeing those things, we began to wonder, how did it become like that? And then how is that made? How does, why is that shape changing? How does that thing produce light? How does it move forward? You know, what was the logic, the construction logic of assembly, putting those things together? So we had this intense curiosity of wanting to know why things were what they were and how they got to be that way. We wanted to know the architects that we were always thinking about, which was primarily, we knew many, we had our working history was pretty extensive. We wanted to know an alto building in plan and section, and we would open a book and we'd stare at it and study it, and we would be diagramming it on the side, and then we'd close the book and try to draw the plan from memory. We do the same thing with section, and we would then also want to compare, for instance, courtyard schemes, one by Alvar Aalto and Sanazzolo, which is a civic building, and then La Tourette, which is also a courtyard building. So we would draw the pure courtyard scheme, and then we would evolve the drawing until we got to the building to understand perhaps how they thought about it as they were working on it. So that's being an autodidact, is that we're constantly trying to figure things out. And it's an assumption that there's other people that figure things out before you, and if you pay attention and you work hard, you can learn from that, you know.
Talking about collaboration and authorship, we're actually sitting on Roto's 16-foot long scroll that you call your sketchbook. There's two of them.
There's one in the back. And you can see the layers here.
This is what Roto calls his sketchbook, and people would draw around your sketches until you would draw on top of theirs, and then they would get mad, and then they would draw on top of yours, and then the collaboration begins. Yeah. Could you maybe talk about the role of authorship and the role of a collaborative mind drawing?
All of the years of teaching, what I learned from my son, when he was 10 years old, I decided that I wanted to remodel my house. The reason I was so excited about remodeling my house was having been inspired by Scarpa, a trip that I'd just come back from. And I did a pilgrimage of Sterling and Scarpa on one trip. What really got me excited and jealous at the same time, and it was the first time that I had the kind of jealousy where you didn't say, I want him dead. It was a jealousy that was empathic joy. You know, it was probably seeing Scarpa and Sterling's work and Aalto was the first time that jealousy made me proud that I was in the same tribe as these guys. And they were humans as well as architects, and if they could do it, maybe I could as well. Not ever believing that I could reach those heights, but having a sincere belief that I could get on a trajectory and get mighty close, you know. So so I'd make these pilgrimages and then study the buildings in unusual ways. Scarpa, I was completely excited to see the Bank of Verona, which was all about surface and texture and temperature and color, and then the Castle Vecchio, which is the museum. It's the old castle he turned into a museum. The first time I saw the Bank of Verona, I wanted to see it at nighttime with no lights on. and with white gloves. I wanted to feel up the building, basically. I wanted to walk inside and outside, and I was fortunate to have met one of his chief collaborators, Arrigo Rudy, who agreed to show me whatever I wanted to see in Verona. And so he gave me a tour late at night. It was about 10 o'clock. The streets were quiet, no noise. And I pulled out my white gloves and walked around the whole inside with just the ambient light coming in from the outside and a few lights on the inside. And that's when I discovered that there's a fundamental difference between marble dust and marble itself. It's called scagliola, when you can make a surface look exactly, to your eyes, it looks exactly like marble or granite, and you can't tell. Even the way the light reflects off of it, you can't tell. The way you can tell is when you touch it. Marble retains its temperature, it can be cold, and scagliola, which is basically plaster with dust, is warm. So I was able to read the building with color, with texture, with temperature. It was great. It also made me feel a little bit guilty, feeling up a building, my Catholic thing, But I was really excited. I had a special relationship now with the building. The Castle Vecchio, you can walk around the building, walk through this building, which I did day after day. I was there for 5 days. I'd look at it time and again. And finally what came to me is that there was an ability to make decisions knowing that you were working at full size in real time that you couldn't make if you're working at scale. So he could make something and then get stuck and then walk away from it, and over a 7-year period he could come back a month later while he's working on another part of the building, right? So the entire building becomes the model. I got so excited about it. So I looked at all of Scarpa's work in that way. I came back and ripped off the back of my house. Wasn't sure what I was going to do. I just decided that I was going to push myself beyond the point of return. So my 10-year-old son and myself, we just ripped off the whole back of our house. And started over the next, I decided I was going to take 5 years rebuilding it and adding things and whatever. But I was going to work from sketch to construction. There was no models, there were no construction documents, and there was, most of all, I wanted to push my psychological limits. There was no eraser. I couldn't go backwards, even if I made a mistake. I said, if I make a mistake, I have to work on it until it looks intentional. What I discovered was that all of the mistakes that I worked on, my friends, after 4 years, the first person that I thought it was just a big mess. I thought the house was a big mess. I was afraid to show it to anybody. Tom kept on saying, "Come on, let me come and see it. Let me come and see it." I said, "No, man, no, forget it. No. I'm going to burn it before I show it to anybody." Finally, he shows up one Saturday, and must have been a Saturday because I was there working. I wasn't in Santa Monica. And we walked around and talked about the whole thing. And he thought it was exceptional for lots of reasons, because push yourself to the limit where you can't go backwards. It's like playing chess. Once your hand comes off. My son, during that whole period, till 15, 16 years old, I wanted him to participate in the creative process. I thought that he was mostly going to be listening to me talk. So I would pose the problem, and then I'd say, "Tell me what you're thinking about." And he would say things that I thought at the time were really preposterous. You can't do that. But I didn't say that because I'm trying to be a progressive parent. I'd say, "Okay, let's work this through." And he'd have a pencil, I'd have a pencil, and we'd sketch and talk and sketch. And within an hour, I saw that it was possible. And then I started to really be concerned that I had forgotten how to be that free. So I learned from him over a period of years 10 to 15 years old, that there were many things that I had forgotten, and that he reminded me how I used to be able to think and how I used to be able to behave. And that was a profound lesson for me. So it gave me, when you're young, you don't think about making mistakes. You don't think about having courage, because everything's a science experiment. You know, it was that from the day he was born. Actually, when he was born, is when I began teaching. I immediately started to think about what I'm on parallel tracks. Is there any relationship or correspondence between teaching strangers and raising a child? And they're very similar. They're very similar. Both become accurate tape recordings, and so you have to be very clear in not only what you're saying but what your intentions are, because it's a long-term play. You know, with your kid, we remember everything. There isn't anything we forget. The context that we're in is what triggers the memory, whatever that might be. So things you don't even know you absorbed pop out at times, and you go, "Oh my God, I remember doing that." Yeah, but I don't remember remembering that. So he showed me through our interactions how I should interact with students. And I began to believe, and I still believe this is one of the things that never changes, and it's unshakable. I'll go to my death with a gun to my head. We're not born empty. From the moment of conception to the moment of birth, every cell that becomes you has lived creation itself. It's gone from nothing to something. We don't have access to that in a conscious way, but we have access to that in a deep subconscious. That's what prayer is about. Prayer isn't negotiating with God. Prayer is getting access to the experience of creation itself. That's what I believe. So, my role as a teacher is to try to create the conditions that bring out the capacity that's already inside of you, and then help you figure out what to do with it once it comes out. Right? So it's a kind of mentoring. You know, it doesn't preclude me getting angry once in a while, saying you're stupid, I'm going to send you back to your country. You know, I don't say that actually, but sometimes I think it. You know, immigration. You know, come and get this guy. But I think all of us are put here to try to create the conditions for the other person to do things in ways that remind us of what we're capable of doing ourselves. So it's a truly interactive situation. I've found over the years that I can understand things better and I can express them better, but I still think the same. When I was a child, it was the same thing. My brother's success was my success. My friend's success was my success. And some people define that as generosity. I define that as being self-serving. If I help you, in turn, you're gonna help me. You know, I smile, you smile. It's basically that. So teaching for me is part of my life work, and my biggest project is myself. And if I can live as an example of what I believe, and it's not easy. It's not easy. Then it's possible that others are going to say, gee, I might be able to be like that too. Not to be like me in terms of my personality or my character or what I do, but you begin to see through me a reflection of yourself. And you start to regain the strength you had as a child. You start to regain the confidence you had as a child. You start to regain the deep intelligence you had when you were ignorant of most things that get in the way of your imagination. You know, and so it's a really profound relationship that I think it's possible to have with other people all of the time. And the format that we call teaching is, I think, one of the most exceptional gifts that anyone could be given, evolution is based on teaching and learning. So the work we do is basically an evolutionary imperative. That goes from the teaching to the architecture. I think it's possible, instead of to show people how big my muscles are, I'm trying to still, to this day, I have a belief that it may be possible to make an architecture that is less than visible, that makes people feel more intelligent, not even more inspired, just to make them better human beings. It brings out their humanity. It brings out their humanity.
Talking about your architecture, there are certain themes that you work with, which are process, order, and unity. Could you maybe elaborate on how they work together or how they respond to your work?
Yeah, I see. They're all, process, order, and unity are all connected. I mean, everything's connected. But specifically, I'm always making lists. I'm putting words together and then unpacking them so that it was basically, that's part of my teaching. So when I was at SciArc, my project ultimately became about change. In the early days, the idea was that everything can change constantly, that it doesn't have to be fixed. And then you resist anything that comes into the system and says, this has to take form, but then things in the system, existing in the system, have to basically adjust to allow that to happen. Institutional structures that we've constructed around us, even our own lives, conceptually we can change. We can change in our mind, but we don't let change into our lives, right? What was the question again?
Process, order, and unity.
The process is change. Order are the rules by which change occurs. And unity is what everything is trying to do. Everything is trying to aggregate into bigger and bigger wholes. That's what complexity theory is about. Complexity theory is about connecting the dots. And when it's connecting the dots, it's trying to connect them as quickly as possible and with fluency. So speed, connectivity, and fluency is basically the way nature works. It's always looking for new connections in order to continually aggregate everything into a greater whole, even though sometimes it's sardines and bananas, you know. And this is what an architect does. We synthesize. In order to synthesize, you have to have a synthetic mind. And the way you have a synthetic mind isn't by making things look a certain way, is by understanding how they became that way in the first place, so that you can now intervene in the process of that thing becoming what it becomes, as opposed to dealing with the surface or just dealing with the form.
Talking about the form, a lot of your work used to use certain unique elements that are inserted into what could be called a traditional building. So there's elements that are elaborated within the building. Could you talk about the idea of inserting these characters into the buildings?
Anything specific? You mean an existing building or?
A lot of your sketches and the 2005 art and the the Texas University.
Well, there was a period when it has to do with the role of memory. And when you're young, if you were to draw a line that, do you have any younger siblings? Yeah, okay. You draw a line, and this is birth on this side, and that's death on that side, okay? You're somewhere in that line. Let's say this is 80 here, and that's 0, all right? When you're a child, in here, everything you talk about is facing forward. When you reach midlife, your stories are equally about the past and the future. When I thought about this, my father was 88 years old. All he talked about was the past. Right? So somewhere in here it becomes a conceptual. When you're young, it's a conceptual issue of how do you fit something new into something old. Usually you do something rude, you know. I'm gonna like, so it's like parasitic. I mean, you know, there's all of those words where you're doing something rude, you know. Although, you know, cool, and you're not trying to hurt anybody. You know, you just want people to know you've been there, you know. I reached a point in my life, actually it was in midlife, two things. I was living in Philadelphia on and off teaching for a semester, and I was in a townhouse, and there was 3 floors. Joseph Rickworth, the great historian, was on the 3rd floor. Oh no, he was on the 2nd floor. Juvenal Barraco, a wonderful Peruvian architect, was on the top floor, and I was on the bottom floor. And so I was friends with both of them. I became friends with, and I had dinner with both of them. I'm very flexible, yeah. Well, Juvenal didn't like Joseph. Joseph, who was a hardcore, proper Englishman, didn't like Juvenal for whatever reasons. I'd have dinner with both of them and have conversations that varied. Juvenal, one night at dinner, he says, I'm listening to you for the last couple of weeks. He says, you're 35, 37 years old? I go, yeah, spot on. I'm 36. And he goes, huh. I go, how did you know that? And he said, because you talk as much about the past as you do about the future. And when he said that, whenever I would hear anything at all, I diagram things in my head. So this diagram that I just drew on this table was from that moment. I put my son, who was like 7 years old here, my father, who was about 75 at that time, and I was right there. And then as soon as we finished dinner, I probably at dinner, I pull out my little notebooks, and I write it down. And it got me thinking about, and for me, the question, whenever anything new enters my life or my mind, I'm always thinking, what's the architectural equivalent of this? I want to turn everything into architecture and everything into experience beyond architecture. So this had to do with memory and invention. You're inventing a life looking forward. You're remembering the life you invented looking back. That took me to thinking about my family. And I thought, wow, inside the house, it's like an old world Italian family. Even though we're cool, we dress like we're, you know, regular kids in America. My mother, my father, you know, people that came to visit them. It's like we were in the old country. Tradition inside. In my neighborhood, there were no 2 ethnicities alike. We were an Italian family across the street. There was a family from Tokyo. Next door to them was a family from Russia. They were Jewish Russians. Down the street was a Mexican family. You know, so it was boom, 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 boom. Never entered my mind that we had any difference. We were all kids growing up. You know, what was cool is that you get tired of your mother's cooking, you go have some sushi, or you go over here and get some borscht, or you go down there and get some tamales. You know, didn't have any Middle Easterns at that time. Tradition inside the house, the rules of the game were evident, right, from that tradition. Outside the house, we had to invent rules because we were all different. And I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. An architectural equivalent of that is adding on to a house that is built in 1902, and we're putting something contemporary on it. And so we say, what is the DNA of that house? What is the genetic code of that house? And the only thing we knew is how to discover it through drawing. So it's geometry. So we draw for months trying to figure out the DNA is in the geometry. The geometry are the rules. We're now going to make something new and attach it to something old. Is it possible that that new thing can have the genetic code, that's the grandchild, it can have the genetic code of the grandparent? So those geometries come up through the building and then they transform themselves once they reach air. And then that sets up basically the architectural decision-making process. And then you become very rigorous, and you say, structure are on these set of lines, windows are on these set of lines, columns are on these set of lines, right? So that you're basically using the order or the rules the same way you use the order or the rules of any language in order to communicate. That's fluency. That's fluency. So it was always about, what Tom and I always talked about, we don't want it to be easy, right? No Kenny G. We can't make it easy. It has to be complex. As complex as it was for us to get there, somebody has to spend time with it in order to try to figure it out. But we're going to do everything we can to leave clues like Hansel and Gretel and leave breadcrumbs so they can figure it out. But it's for people that spend time. And that hasn't changed either. That hasn't changed either.
Talking about Scarpa and his use of materials, and then now talking about form, let's talk about your dancing brick wall. The idea of pushing materials to do things that they don't traditionally do. How important is it that when you have a wall like that, you still reveal the bricks to show that it's
See,
still
for me, it's also another thing is about continuity. It's not about, winning the battle over a material or winning the battle over this. For me, it's about continuity. To merely, Lucan asked the brick what it wanted to be, and it said an arch. I don't care for arches. I mean, I don't mind looking at them, but they've been done, and I'm not interested. Especially coming from Los Angeles, where people were promiscuous with not even architectural character, just architectural look. They were so promiscuous that you in my neighborhood my neighborhood was a working class neighborhood, so things had no frills. We lived in a fairly big house because it was made by an Italian guy, an Italian immigrant, so it had a full cellar. But a lot of other things in East Hollywood and Hollywood, and you can still see it to this day. Somebody went to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and then they went to France, and then they went to Canada, and then they went someplace else, and they came back and they put it all on their house. If that was food, you wouldn't want to put it in your mouth, That's another thing I always thought, is that was food. I look at something and I say, whoa, if that was food, it wouldn't taste very good. They didn't understand the nature of language. All right. So, with the brick, we had never been asked to use brick before. We're working on a campus in Texas. Every building's brick, but they're flash-fired bricks, so they're not even real bricks. They make them look old. So I immediately negotiate that we're going to get wire-cut bricks because it has a really wonderful texture to them, and they're all going to be made from pure clay, no flash-fired. And then they all have to be structural. No Z-brick, no thin. So it has to work. All right. One of the things that I had learned to do just prior to Prairie View is to look at other cultures. I went on a pilgrimage at about this time, midlife, because I wanted to see if it was possible to now integrate the rest of my body to my mind because it had been disembodied through university, I mean, the way you know this is like when I ask students, tell me what your traditions are. They mildly reject tradition because they're wrestling with it. And then if you say, tell me what religion, I'm an atheist, there is no God. Everybody says the same thing. There is no God. And I realized, wow, the only way everybody could say the same thing is if they were going through another identity crisis. And it's not a crisis, you're just trying to define yourself. There's a period in your life you got no parents, right? And then you come back to it again. Well, one of the first things, I worked with Native Americans for 6 years, and I was wanting to know more about their culture so that I could help myself become more integrated in terms of body, mind, and spirit, because earth-based cultures, historically, when you read their creation stories, they're about living in right relation or being fair and just with every other living thing, including rocks, and especially each other. And then the most profound aspects of those stories inform their most practical daily routines. And that was really amazing to me, that the practical and the profound were connected to each other. And then I put poetic in the middle. That's the architecture. So I said, okay, practical to profound, what are we missing? We're missing the poetic. That's the architecture. So the architecture became, it modulated that transfer from one to the other. So it wasn't about, boom, here it is, take a look at it, ain't I great? It was like wind blowing or water flowing. So it was so we spend time with the elders, lots of time with the elders, listening to their stories. And the objective was to listen to their stories in a way that we can now convert those into architecture. Well, a little bit fast forward, get to Prairie View. I'm wondering, this is a historically black, 90% African American, the campus. And I was excited that it wasn't Harvard or it wasn't one of the Ivy Leagues, that it was putting up a good building in a place that no one expected anything good to happen, right? So through that, I was able to convince the president to put it at the front of the university instead of way in the back. And he goes, but that's where my house is going to be built. I said, you want more privacy. Put your house way at the back, and then you could go home and forget about it. He goes, you're right. Put the building here. Well, I wanted to know who built all these campus buildings. It turned out that mostly all of the Masons were African Americans. So I said, whoa, okay. If an African American is going to build a building today out of brick, what would be his motivation? It wouldn't be theory, it'd be music. Right? So Lucan said, he asked the brick what it wanted to be, and it said an arch, a thing. You ask students what they want to be, and they'll describe a verb. That was easy. So I said, oh, okay. We asked the brick what it wanted to do, not what it wanted to be, but what it wanted to do. And then, all of the officials say, what did it say? I said, it wanted to dance. And then all the students just erupt. They say, absolutely, and then they all start dancing, and there is no turning back. So we're trying to figure out how do you afford to do this? How do you make it easy for them to understand? Because things can get value engineered out, and they can use technical reasons, not just dollars, but technical reasons. So you confront that. Because I knew construction, I grew up in construction. Nobody could talk construction beyond me. So, and then you could show them through the drawings that this is easy to build, right? So anyways, the bricks danced. I was just there last week, actually.
Talking about what things want to do and what things want to be, let's talk about what things are as they are right now. The Eames office had a video produced in 1977 called Power of 10.
Yeah.
That you said in one of your lectures that you would hope that people wanted to be an architect because of that video. Could you maybe talk about the reasoning why that video is such an inspiration, or what it drives?
Scale shifting. We work not just small, medium, and large, but we can take ideas from inside of our head and imagine a city. We could take ideas in our head and imagine a building. And it's not only the scale of objects, it's the scale of society. You can imagine a place for 2 people to be or 2,000 people to be. So the ability to scale shift is critical to not only how things change in size and impact, but it's the basis of metaphor. How can you look at an ant colony and start talking about human societies without being able to shift scale from those little guys to us? and then all the other stuff in between. So it's just like a little thing to a big thing, but it's little processes to big processes. The next thing is, what are the rules of the game? Little and big. And you realize that in principle, the rules of the game are really they're identical. The basic imprint that keeps us moving forward is survival. Survival. Doesn't matter what the creature is, big or small. It's survival. In our case, we can add consciousness to that. So intelligence, consciousness, awareness, and insight are all part of the evolutionary trajectory of our species. So it's not just, money, 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 money. I mean, it sells ourselves short. It's like having an itch. It's like right now our species has a rash. And then that rash is, it's not even about money anymore. It's like making the number go bigger. And it's not even about you're accumulating money. I mean, who really knows how much $1 billion is? It's a number. A guy says, oh, you're worth 5 billion? Oh, I'm worth 7 billion. 7 billion what? In the end, what I've seen, in the end, when you're on your deathbed, the only thing that matters is how much love has been in your orbit. Material things don't matter at that point in time. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter at all. Is it possible to structure and live a life in a way where it begins to matter not on your deathbed, but way before? And it doesn't mean that it makes a struggle, especially as an architect, especially as somebody who's, trying to live life in a fairly comfortable way. It's a struggle, but the payback is seeing the sparkle in people's eyes or seeing them smile when they've discovered something because you created the conditions for that to occur.
Usually I plan a last question to wrap up the conversation.
What's the last question?
No, this time I'm going to let you leave the conversation with final comments from yourself without there being a question.
Maybe I mean, there's lots of things I could talk about. Right now, I feel so proud of SCI-Arc. I'm probably going to get emotional. The reason being, SCI-Arc has finally been handed over truly to the next generation. And the next generation are really, really good people. Smart, talented, and compassionate. Who would have known? Who would have known? SCI-Arc isn't a place that competes with the world. It's a gift to the world. What I've seen over the years, especially when you see undergraduate thesis and graduate thesis when everybody comes in, it's like they're coming to the watering hole. It's the source. SCI-Arc is the sun, and it offers itself to the world, and that's the way we originally talked about it. There's things that we can do at SCI-Arc that other places can't do. We don't do it to best them. We do it so that it's open source. Anybody can then take it back to their own place and makes the world better. So the school itself has been my role model. Everything that I aspire to being, it's been great fortune to see the school be that. In all of its struggles, its confusions, it fights like a family, it hugs and kisses like a family. But right now, I think it was really critical that there's continuity. The people that are running this place have been a part of it. They came from another place. They are from SCI-Arc now. And they're going to take it in places that I couldn't even imagine. Now, I'll pretend that oh yeah, I knew that, you know. But it's a great time for the school. It's a great time for the city. I think it's a great time for architecture, and it's definitely going to be a great time for the world, because SCI-Arc is also a sanctuary for all of you that come from places all over the planet. Why? For the same reasons your grandparents would have imagined coming to America. The same reason my father came to America. He was looking for freedom. My father wasn't looking for political freedom. He was looking for creative freedom. SCI-Arc offers that. SCI-Arc offers that. And it's, I've been, I don't know, fortunate seems to be an understatement to still be part of the place, you know? I mean, I'm surprised nobody's kicked me out sooner, you know?
SCI-Arc's son, friend, brother, father, educator, provocateur, and philosopher, and most of all, we are part of your family, you are part of ours. Thank you so
And
much,
I'm
Rotondi.
proud to have you part of the family.
Thank you.
All right, good. Double bump.